The morning I found the letter well. The morning it stopped being just a letter. My hands were still warm from the coffee mug, and my dog, Roscoe, was doing that ankle nudge he does when he wants to remind you he exists. And I remember thinking, plain as day, that small things are the ones that tell you when something has changed. Because big things don't just show up without a series of small, crooked footsteps leading up to them. That's how it started, a small crooked step. And then another. And by the time the neighborhood had a name for it, we were already 3 moves behind. My name's Ethan Cole. I'm 59. Retired from the shipyards. Which is a fancy way of saying I can spot a bad weld from a mile away, and I can't sit still when there's a problem. My wife, Maggie. She organizes chaos for fun if you saw her. You'd laugh. Because she has a way of making lists that make other lists feel lazy. We live in Holloway Springs. A place that smells like pine in the summer and like wet grass in the spring. A place where people still wave when your truck lumbers past. We thought we were in the kind of place where neighbors borrowed sugar and left it on porches with a sticky note. We thought we knew the map of our lives here. Turns out there are pockets of that map no one draws on any of the official papers. The first crooked step was a tampered envelope. Nothing dramatic. It was a routine thing. An envelope from the VA containing some paperwork that meant as much to me as a dented toolbox. I pulled it from the mailbox, and the flap had been pried open and then pushed back. There was a smear, small, almost casual, like someone had fumbled and tried to be neat about it. I didn't think anything at the moment. People are messy. Mail is messy. But when a neighbor told Maggie that her EBT replacement card had been swiped, and the next week Mrs. Hennigan's prescription was late because her pharmacy claimed a package never arrived, that's when the pattern stopped being a story you tell at coffee and started being a line of dots that connect to make a picture you don't want on your wall. There are certain things you learn about people when you watch how they react to small violations. Some folks forget and shrug. And some folks lock their doors. Maggie. She tightened. She's not confrontational. Not in the dramatic way. But she's fierce about procedure, about records. About proof. I love that about her. It's the kind of love that files complaints and copies receipts and then laughs about being romantic because it makes dinner planning so easy. Our neighborhood had a name for its power center long before I ever bothered to learn it. Willow Creek Residents Association. They maintained things. Approved paint colors. And, over a decade, they had quietly made themselves the spine of the place. The people on the board could call a meeting, declare a rule, send a letter, and suddenly the weight of a dozen lives shifted a millimeter. Lydia Marlowe was the one who crossed the threshold between organizer and monarch. Lydia was sharp and certain. She had the sort of poise that makes people follow directions without thinking. And an instinct for the optics of control, the right flowers, the right sign, the right vigilant note left on your windshield. She made members feel like being watched was actually community care. She liked the sound of her name in a room. Her second in command was Gavin Rhee, a man who preferred other people's opinions hand-delivered and signed. Lydia's enforcer, if you want to call him that without making the neighborhood gossip sound like a movie, was Dean, a man who liked the idea of muscle more than the muscles themselves. It's easy to paint villains with broad strokes in stories. But real pressure comes from motives that feel plausible. Lydia had reasons. She loved order. She had a mortgage on decency, and she collected fines for missed cuttings and uneven hedges the way some people collect stamps. Gavin loved to be useful, and Lydia made sure he was. Dean wanted to be seen. And he liked doing Lydia's small dirty work because it made him matter. Motive is a slow-turning gear. It doesn't make someone do wrong overnight, but it does grease the chain that eventually grinds through someone else's life. Our response began in the usual, middle American way, with notes and polite requests. With Maggie phoning the HOA and asking for records. With me walking the streets and asking if anyone else had suffered missing mail. That's neighborhood-level detective work, old-fashioned. Human. We collected names. We collected dates. We wrote emails that were polite but sharp. Lydia was a master of plausible deniability. She ran meetings like rehearsals for confessionals, left feeling like you'd been heard, but not like anything would change. Then the harassment escalated. At first it was petty. A sprinkler pointed at my porch one morning. Me porch. Whose wood I'd varnished 3 summers ago, or a trash can knocked, and its contents flung like someone tried to make art from our trash day. Then cameras we'd placed to see if a raccoon had taken to our bird feeder were smeared with grease. Not broken. Just made useless for a week. Someone cut the solar camera's wire at the back. Neat little snip. Those were the moments when my chest would tighten. Like someone letting a rope out from under me. Little by little. You learn to live with the tension. But there's a notch where tension becomes fear. Maggie and I did not want to be vigilantes. We weren't looking for a show. What we wanted was proof solid. Undeniable proof that the pattern of missing mail and tampering belonged to someone. And preferably to someone who had the authority to call the police rather than us. We started with what neighbors had, timestamps from doorbell cameras. A handwritten ledger from a mail carrier who had taken to writing down odd deliveries. A string of complaints lodged with the association. We made a timeline Maggie's favorite tool, and it showed a series of incidents that not only lined up in time, but had a geography to them. An arc that swung like a pendulum from one cul-de-sac to another. The temptation. The call to test and trap that's human. We had a neighbor who'd been robbed of packages every month and who had a fury that smelled like justice. He wanted to nail someone to a tree with an old nail gun. I told him not to. Because what we needed was something the police wouldn't toss as hearsay, something official. Not to be dramatic. But there are laws about mail tampering, federal laws, and if you want someone prosecuted, it's better when your evidence makes a federal agent's eyebrows go up. So we set a bait. Now I'm careful here. I won't give you a step-by-step for how to bait or trap or whatever else you're thinking. This is a story. Not an instruction manual. What I will say is this. We created a decoy package that looked ordinary. Something that would normally sit safe in a mailbox. And we put it out at a time when someone, if one of those crooked footsteps was coming, might be tempted to reach in. The point wasn't to harm. It was to reveal. To make visible what had been moving in the shadow. The day it happened. The air smelled like rain, even though the sky was dry. We had a handful of neighbors who'd agreed to watch. Not because they wanted to be in the middle of anything dramatic, but because they were tired of being powerless. I remember standing there, feeling a ridiculous sense of adolescent excitement sneaking around and whispering and waiting while Maggie, calm as ever, checked her phone and made notes. Then someone reached in. People say the moment of discovery is cinematic. And in a strange way, it was. Lydia's hand, the woman we had been trying to avoid turning the whole neighborhood against, reached into that box like any other hand. With the same casual certainty. Like she was collecting a debt. Her face was that cool. Practiced blank you learn when you've led a board meeting too many times and had to deliver bad news with a smile. For a second it's quiet. The kind of quiet that sheets over everyone's lungs. And then the reaction, it was immediate and messy and human and perfect. She pulled back and there was a visible mark on her skin. Something that made her look like she'd been caught with flour on her wrist. The neighbors who'd been watching had phones out in a second. Someone laughed. A short, stunned sound. Someone else swore. Lydia's jaw clenched. What I will not do is gloat over her embarrassment, because humiliation doesn't equate to guilt. And I don't want this to be a tale of me standing on anyone's shoulders. But I will say this, it was an honest, raw moment. Her power shut down publicly for the first time. She'd always counted on the polished quiet of authority. In that moment, authority was stained and smudged. And the neighborhood saw it. That's when the gloves came off. Retaliation was predictable and petty, and then it grew teeth. The association sent out a formal notice the following week, accusing me, in carefully chosen words, of harassing the board and causing public disturbances. My mailbox got a polite, typed violation for a post that had a chip in the paint. Financeable. Enforceable. Dean showed up one night and spray-painted trash on our driveway in fat block letters like a child with a tin of paint. There were accusations that we'd staged things to get Lydia fired. That we were theatrical troublemakers who enjoyed drama. Some neighbors muttered about escalation and about not taking sides. Others took to whispering confirmations that yes, someone had been taking things. That their missing meds suggested a pattern. When someone breaks the law, the first tricky thing is proving who did it. The second tricky thing is proving why. Lydia, to her credit, was savvy. She knew how to write an email that sounded reasonable and a letter that read like community concern. But she and Gavin and Dean had a problem no hubris could easily solve. There were multiple private recordings we'd collected, doorbell footage, neighbor phones, timestamps, and a pre-existing ledger from Samir, the mail carrier, who'd been with the route for 15 years and who had a memory that was stubbornly honest. Samir had noticed patterns, but hadn't spoken up, because what did a mailman know? He knew when schedules shifted. He knew when someone stopped at the box after hours. He had a note of times and dates, and an eye that said he'd rather not be here. But he'd file what he saw. When he finally brought his ledger to the inspector, it read like a map of small crimes. We did something else we were careful to narrate and not to instruct. We made sure every step we took could be explained in court if it ever got there. That meant we talked to the Postal Inspection Service early. That's the outfit that handles mail crimes. And they're not big on theatrics. They wanted records, not the kind of dramatic reveal that makes a TV host laugh, but the kind of dry, legal cadence that makes prosecutors happy. We gave them what we had: timestamps, neighbor statements, Samir's ledger, footage that showed hands, not faces with a few exceptions. We did not stake out people. We documented. That distinction matters because it's the difference between being a community that defends itself and being people who fall into the very lawlessness we despise. When the inspectors came, they were quiet and professional, and they didn't take sides. They asked questions that made Maggie smile in spite of herself because they liked detail and she loved to give it. They also made clear what would be considered evidence-worthy and what would be dismissed. It wasn't about moral righteousness. It was about legibility. Could this be read by a court? Would a jury see it as more than neighborhood squabbling? That's when the real drama started. The sort that reads like it might be ripped from a TV script, but was, in fact, life. The HOA meeting. Lydia called it. Probably because she wanted to quash rumor with a show of force. She wanted the room to be hers, to control the narrative. But what she hadn't accounted for was a projector and a stack of files that the inspectors had allowed us to present documents, timestamps, and a series of videos that, when pulled together, told a story no amount of charm could smooth over. I remember standing in front of the room. My knees were a little weak. And I'm not ashamed to say Roscoe's absence felt like a loss because he would have strolled in and been the dampener on everyone's tension in the first clip played. It wasn't cinematic. Not in a Hollywood sense. It was grainy. Handheld footage that paused and resumed. But the sequence showed hands reaching where they shouldn't have. And a route that traced like a dotted line between a dozen small thefts and the places someone with the HOA's access could manipulate. The room was silent in a new way. The kind where people stop arranging their faces to say things politely and start listening to the unadorned truth. Lydia rose after the first few minutes and told a line so practiced it could have been written in the margins of a handbook. She denied wrongdoing, suggested political motivations, and accused me of orchestrating a smear campaign. She said words like calumny and fabrication, ones she probably learned from someone who liked big language. Gavin looked stricken, as if he'd been asked an impossible question. Dean's jaw was seethed. Come to the meeting because he was sure things would bend in their favor. He liked being sure. Then the inspector stepped in. That's the pivotal piece that makes this a story about justice rather than vigilante revenge. They had probable cause. They presented evidence that narrowed the field from someone in town to a small set of people with motive and access. There are technicalities. I will not bore you with, laws and filings, and terms you only truly know if you've had to learn them, but suffice to say, with chain of custody and certain legal thresholds satisfied, they made arrests. Not dramatic. Not in the way movies like to show, but swift and clinical. Like a door gently closing on something that had no right to be open. I won't pretend it was an entirely clean victory. Lydia pled guilty to a set of charges that punished her role, and Gavin took a plea that suggested he regretted more than his actions. Dean, who liked being seen, pleaded down to community service after admitting to acts of intimidation. There was restitution. Some money put back in the coffers of people who'd lost things. And a public apology that read like a... The HOA board was dissolved and reformed under new leadership. Which, in the end, felt like the easiest part because you can reconstitute committees with signatures. You can't as easily reboot the way someone has used small power to make a community feel unsafe. There's an ethical tangent here. I want to be honest about the thing that kept me up at night. We put a decoy out. Some would say that legally and morally we walked on morally ambiguous ground. The inspectors understood that, and they were the ones who told us to stop any further baiting and to let them handle the arrests. We complied. I say that not to pat ourselves on the back, but because the difference between right and wrong in that gray area is often shaped by accountability. We didn't act alone after the bait. We handed off. That's what makes the difference between a neighbor with a grudge and a community that wants the law followed. After the arrests, life in Holloway Springs slotted back into a groove that looked a lot like the old groove, but hummed differently underneath. People were kinder in the obvious ways. Neighbors waved more. People returned borrowed tools without shame, but there were quieter shifts that were more telling. Meeting agendas were circulated a week earlier. Decisions were explained in plain language. And there was a new emphasis on transparency. A word that can sound bland, but when practiced feels like sunlight. Lydia moved away 6 months later. You can argue whether that was a graceful exit or a forced exile. The truth is it made some people feel better and others resentful. That's the thing about justice. It rarely leaves everyone satisfied. For Maggie and me, the tangible aftermath was small and slow. We painted over the trash on our driveway and made a new mailbox post because some things are symbolic and deserve to look like they belong in your yard. We put a little plaque by the mailbox, nothing showy, just a nod to the morning when we realized our lives had a different axis. But the more subtle thing was this. I started checking in with neighbors more often. I learned how long it takes for a person to go from silent to outraged. And I understood the responsibility of being the one who notices first. People talk about being good neighbors like it's a passive thing. It's not. It's active. It takes time and records and sometimes, yes, steps that make you uncomfortable. I know some of you will be sitting there wondering about vigilantism and fairness and what right we had to push any kind of trap into our lives. That's a fair question. And it's worth debating. My defense is simple. The decisions we made were guided by the desire to make the home a safe place again. Not to get a reaction or to humiliate someone. We documented. We sought counsel. And we invited law enforcement in. That, to me, is the difference. There were lessons, too, about power and quiet cruelty. Lydia's favoring of small rules and fines was, at root, a hunger for order. She could control an understandable human appetite, but it became poisonous in the way it could be wielded against people she didn't like. That's a pattern you see in small power centers everywhere, the temptation to treat petty authority as a weapon. When that happens, communities fracture. When it's exposed, they heal slowly, and not perfectly. If I had to pick a single moment that changed everything, it wasn't the mark on Lydia's wrist or the arrests or even the meeting where the projector hummed and the evidence played, though those moments mattered. It was the ledger that Samir handed over. The one his handwriting made honest and human. The one that said, in small, tired script, what a route looked like when someone morphed it into an opportunity. It was a reminder that power often hides in routines, the familiarity of a route, the follow-through of a name on a ledger. And it was a reminder that if enough people pay attention to those routines, the story starts to add up. This is not the tidy kind of story that ends with everyone holding hands and singing. There are bruises, reputational and otherwise, that may not heal quickly. People who defended Lydia will say she was pushed out. People who suffered will feel vindicated but uneasy. Because justice is slow and imperfect. What I want to leave you with is not a prescription, but a prompt. Notice the small things. Keep your records. Talk to the people you trust. If something feels wrong, document it politely, clearly, with an eye toward the law. Because the law, as flawed as it is, gives you a way to make things legible to others. And lastly, this is the part one always forget to say until it seems like the end of a story. I want to ask you something. Tell me what you would have done. Was it fair to set a decoy? Was it a necessary push to break a pattern of quiet abuse? Or a dangerous step toward creating the problem we feared? Where do we draw the line between protecting our home and playing judge? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell us when you've seen small abuses of power in your own town. How you reacted. What worked and what backfired. Share the story so people know the difference between community care and control. If you like this, hit like, subscribe, and pass it on, because stories only do their work when we talk about them out loud, when we argue, and when we learn together.